Okay, well, we'll start, David, with your early memories, because I've read in the memoir your
Mm-hmm.
Pearl Harbor and things like this. It just struck me as interesting that the sort of the military thing was dominant in your early childhood because, of course, it was World War II.
Well, that's right. A lot of our parents were away at war, so those early years for me, between 5 and 10, or 6 and 10 anyway, no father in the house, and I remember the I was right outside that window down by the river with my father when my aunt came running down the hill and said, the war has come, the Japanese had burned Pearl Harbor, bombed Pearl Harbor. And I knew a lot about it, even though I was just a kid, because my father had maps on the wall of all the war fronts, and he knew where the Japanese were in China, and he knew where what was going on in Europe.
Mm.
So I was very much aware of what was going on. So we rushed back to the house, and the first thing I did was get out my toy ships on the floor and recreate Pearl Harbor. And the war was very much dominant. We had some English kids in our school from the bombing. A lot of them came over to America. And the school I was in was very aware that we wanted to return them to their parents as English kids and not little Americans. And we had pledge allegiance to the American flag every morning. And the school put the English flag next to it. So the kids could pledge allegiance, and they didn't have to say to the United States. They could say to the British Empire or England or whatever they wanted to say. But the idea was to be able to let them feel that they were part of it and not just too much in a foreign country. And during the war, my brother and I, we had a little gang of friends, and there's a trestle bridge down the river where the railway tracks go over. And time after time, we canoed down the river to set bombs under that bridge and stop a Japanese train from coming over.
At that point, were you aware or able to be aware of the fact that there was Hitler and Hirohito, or Germany and Japan were the main enemies? Or was
yes. We didn't hear so much about Mussolini, but do you remember those propaganda pictures always had a horrible distortion of Hirohito and Hitler and Mussolini? So we were certainly aware of Mussolini. But my uncle, who grew up in this house, was in Europe, in the Air Force station in London. And my father was in the Pacific. So sometimes we had to have at the Germans, too, who were across the river in Dover, and we had to stop them from invading. And but the uncle was killed in North Africa, and that was a huge moment here. It was my mother's favorite uncle, and so that had a huge impact. The war wasn't just a game.
Tell me a bit about your family, because your father was at war at this time. But had he travelled much in his past, or did he?
Oh, yes, he'd been in Indochina, and he was a naturalist, ornithologist, at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. And he had a great friend named François Delacour, who was a Frenchman, and they had, at least my father had been in Indochina before the war, always spoke to the end of his life of the Annamese and not the Vietnamese. And he was there in 1929, and again with my mother in he must have been there in 1940 or I think 41. No, 39, because he was told that they were told by their French friends that you better get back to home. The war's going to break out in Europe. And in those days, you had to take a train from Hanoi to Saigon and catch the Air France flight. It would fly all day and land in Rangoon. And it took about 5 days to get back to Europe. And it was held up in Benghazi by the Italians who were making trouble for the French. And then a steamer home. There was still no transatlantic flights. Well, I think there were, but they were to Lisbon. That you couldn't fly home from England or France yet.
And did your father have much of an impact on you as a person? Did you hero worship him, or did you respect him, or did you think this is the life I want to lead? Or
no, I never thought I wanted to be an ornithologist. But, I think it was a perfectly normal father-son thing when, I was 5 or 6. After the war, he was completely changed. He got sullen and remote and retreated into alcoholism. So it got harder to know him in his after the war. Was it stress syndrome that we hear so much about today? I think the reason was the war years were so exciting and so interesting that nothing could match it here. And he felt trudging into the museum was rather boring. But who knows?
It's that whole thing of Tom Buchanan being a star as a youth in The Great Gatsby, and everything after the age of 17 reeked of anticlimax.
Well, that's right. So I'm sure everything after, he was quite old. Everything after World War II was an anticlimax.
Mm-hmm. So, carrying on after that, you had a very conventional upbringing, I assume. You went to the Milton Academy, I think it was, after that.
Mm-hmm.
And what were your early thoughts about a so-called career? Did you think in terms of any particular...
Yeah, I thought when I got to college that probably I would end up working for the State Department. And it was an interesting period because it was just when colonialism was beginning to crack up and end. I mean, India was already gone, and Africa would go a few years later, but was still, I think, hadn't cracked. The empires were still there, French and British, Portuguese. And I thought about that until I did graduate school in Oxford. And Oxford has stringers. And as you know, Bruce, that's what someone who gets paid by the piece, and they're not on staff. But it was so much fun. Harrison Salisbury said that being a newspaperman gave shy people a chance to ask questions. So there were lots of people, interesting people at Oxford, and sometimes the magazines would call me and say, we want an interview with this person. One was... I think he was called Salvador de Madriaga. He had been in the loyalist government in Spain. So it was very interesting to talk to him and other people. And there was a guy named Pete Dawkins who'd been a football star in the West Point. And every time I needed a little pocket money, I'd go around to his room and say, Pete, got anything interesting to say today? And he would give me some quote, and I could always sell it to Time or Sports Illustrated. Roll it.
Were there any other implications, or were there any consequences for your occasional work for Time magazine?
Well, yes, I did a piece for Sports Illustrated. It had something to do with wolf's urine. And the Oxford hunt had a drag hunt. And that means you don't actually chase the foxes. You put a scent in a bag, and somebody on a horse drags it around, and the hounds and the horses follow that. So you have to have something stronger than a fox, so the hounds won't go herring off, as you were. And So wolf's urine was the preferred scent. And the London Zoo said they were going to put the price up, and the Oxford Hunt thought that was the end of Western civilization. And Henry Luce liked that piece and said, let me see that young man the next time I come to London. So I came down on the train and was ushered into the presence. And Henry Luce said, well, how did you come down? And I said, well, by train, sir. And he said, well, what class? And I said, well, second class. I thought that would please him. He said, never do that again. Time always travels first class. You can give your ticket to the secretary. She'll reimburse you. But you have to realize that the Time Bureau Chief is the second most important American in Britain after the ambassador. And so that was sort of the way I knew I had the job. And one of my reviewers of my book wrote, no reporter will ever hear those words again. And it didn't last very long. But it's hard to imagine the impact that nowadays, when Time and Life had on the American imagination. I mean, life was, and Time arrived every week with exciting things, and television hadn't caught on that much then. It was here, but it wasn't that big. And so the pictures that Life had from all over the world were stunning, and Time told you what to think. And the Time Life building in London at that time was in the corner of Bruton Street and New Bond, and it hummed with activity for reporters in trench coats flying off to assignments in Africa, and photographers coming in with their film, with dark rooms, and secretaries running around, and researchers, and even a tea trolley would come around at 4 o'clock. So it was a very different existence than now. And the bureau chief had a car and a driver take him around, and it was a last golden age of journalism when these organizations had the money and the willingness to spend it.
And what sort of stories did you get assigned, or did you make up your own ideas for publication?
Both. For example, when I went to work, the Cuban Missile Crisis was on, and people were actually leaving England and going to Ireland and Isle of Wight and thinking maybe a nuclear war was going to happen, and it was great upset. And I was assigned, there was some expert on photography, satellite photography in Britain, and I interviewed him about what the film resolution would have been in Cuba and all that kind of stuff. And then another time, there was a wonderful woman working at the bureau then, called an English woman called Honor Balfour. And I used to be sort of her leg man, do research for her and things. But the Christine Keeler and what was the...
Stephen Ward. Or Mandy Rice Davis.
Yes, Mandy Rice Davis and Stephen Ward, but what was Profumo?
Yes.
Profumo was the British minister, wasn't he?
Minister for War, I think.
It was worse than I thought then. And Christine Keeler had been the mistress of him and the Russian military attaché.
Yes.
And it was a terrific scandal. And I went around with Honor to interview some ancient peer of the realm. Can't remember why, but she knew the people involved. And he said, well, you know, Honor, we haven't entirely forgiven you for that other story. I'm sorry. And so she had to really work hard to get him to talk. And when we walked out, I said, Honor, what was that other story he was talking about? Oh, he meant the abdication crisis. Time was way out ahead on that, and he's never forgiven us. What was that, 36?
And I understand that there was a sort of conflict of not loyalty, but you thought, I would like to stay in England, but then other offers came around which changed your mind on that.
Well, Henry Luce, I'd gotten the job, and he said, he didn't say, I didn't really see him after that first interview. But he said, Time said, you have to go to Washington, and that seemed like an interesting thing to do. So I was glad to go there. And the Kennedy administration was in flower, and it was all very exciting. And we had a little house in Georgetown, and you couldn't say I was part of the Georgetown set. I was much too junior, but all those people were there and around.
And did you report on any specific part of the administration, or?
No, I was too junior to have a big job there, but I did have an interesting interview with Averell Harriman at the State Department. I think he was have something to do with Latin America. But for some strange reason, he got talking about how he and a few friends, influential people in the Democratic Party, had gotten Roosevelt to dump Henry Wallace and pick Truman. And how important that was, because he said, imagine if Wallace had been president in 1945, Wallace being so far left. And he said, it just shows you how important it is in the American system to have a sound vice president. And he'd strayed off the interview subject, but we talked enough about South America. I had my notes. I went back to the Time Bureau, and they said, get over to the White House right away. Kennedy's been shot in Dallas. And the important reporters on the White House beat were all in Dallas. So I went over to the White House, and here this center of everything was now just a backwater. And nobody knew what to do. Nobody was calling the White House and telling the aides left behind what the condition was. Everyone was watching television.
Because other people were abroad. Wasn't McNamara on a plane to Hawaii and things like that?
Well, I knew that Rusk
was there,
yeah.
Yes.
But, yes, but there was terrific confusion. And when the television said that the president was dead, there was a kind of argument in the White House, is it official? Can we lower the flag? Should we lower the flag? And others said, no, we cannot lower the flag until it's official. Well, when is it official, you see? So it was a terrific confusion.
I'll get back to those questions later, but specifically on Vietnam, you arrived in, was it 65 or?
67.
67. At that point, there must have been a lot more cynicism than there was earlier in the correspondence community.
Yes.
When you got there, did you instantly comprehend the problem and instantly understand the pressure of the existing journalists there about the so-called credibility gap? And if so, apart from that, how long did it take you to have your own evidence of this problem with reporting of the war? I
got there in the spring of 67, and I have these letters from my father that I wrote to my father that he kept. And by the late summer and fall, I was writing to him, I don't think we can really expect to win this war. And we'll get tired of it and go home like the French. So, it took me several months to come around.
And in that period, did you spend most of your time in Saigon, or did you go on specific assignments out to sea?
I was a field guy. I spent very little time in Saigon. There were other people who looked after Saigon and the domestic politics. And I just went most of my time in I Corps up in the north with the Marines. But I went to the Delta and to the Central Highlands. But I was covering the fighting of the war. And I didn't spend that much time in Saigon.
And you must have had close relationships with officers, and you'd see them again. And did you find the frankness of your contacts extremely straightforward so that you could rely entirely on what they would tell you?
The lower the grade, the straighter the story, because the lieutenants knew what was going on. But the closer you got to headquarters, the more rosy the picture would become. And when you got to Saigon, you had the 5 o'clock volleys. And I saw an example of how this would happen. There was some firefight, and they found, I can't remember, 3 or 4 dead North Vietnamese. And they said, well, this was such an intense firefight, it must have been more. And they always like to drag their dead away if they can. So let's report to headquarters that there are, say, twice that number.
They would also say blood trails suggest.
Yeah, but even when the blood trails didn't suggest. And then I found out later that when that got to... So they said double the number. And when it got down to Saigon, the number was tripled. So when McNamara said, by every indication we have, by every measurement we have of winning the war, he could be somewhat excused, but the measurements didn't mean anything. So the whole thing was just a house of cards.
And what about on those visits by senior officials or State Department or military into the field? Did you ever talk to them, or did they want you to brief them about what you thought, or was it?
There were congressional people who did. I remember Fulbright's staff had a couple of very good people, and they would deliberately talk to the press, seek them out, said, how's it look from your point of view? And of course we'd give them a completely different story than the brass would.
And what about the response of your editors back in the States? Did you ever feel that your stories were disbelieved by Time? Because at that point, Time hadn't become as skeptical as they did.
Time completely disbelieved our stories, and it was a constant frustration. And it didn't really change until 68, and there was a cover story. It must have been the fall of 67, of doubts about the war, blasted across the cover, and it showed a guy at Contien hovering in a foxhole. And I was on the publisher's letter. They featured me there in that issue. And that was when the pessimism began. The Time began to doubt itself. But Henry Lucid died in 67. And Hedley Donovan, who took his place, he didn't equate this with China the way Henry Lucid, remember, was born in China and thought, we can't lose Indochina. Yeah. And Hedley Donovan would come out and talk to us and have dinner with us and get our opinions. And so it began to change in 67, the attitude of the magazine.
How big was the bureau in Vietnam at that point? And who was the bureau chief?
Simmons Fentress when I first got there. It was about 5 or 6 reporters. At least. I'd have to try to, but I mean, that's not exact, but just about.
And tell me about that big major event, the Tet Offensive in January, February 68.
February 68. I was in Hong Kong then on a home leave, R&R. And I had to get back to, I got to Bangkok and then caught a military flight back to Saigon because there were no commercial flights flying during that. And immediately I went up to the I Corps because I was sort of the guy on the northern front. And soon was involved with the fighting in Hue. Now that was interesting because although I'd been with Marines through villages, I'd never been in urban warfare before. And I don't think the Marines got into a scrap-like way until Fallujah in Iraq, in an urban setting like that.
Tell me more about that event, because it was quite traumatic for you as well after that.
Well, when I was shot, yeah. Well, we were with a Marine detachment, and some kid Marine foolishly, there was a wall, no roof, one wall with a window, but no roof, no house left. And he looked through the window and got shot in the throat. And the corpsman was too little was having trouble carrying him. So
He was conscious?
I'm not sure whether he was conscious or not. But I came and helped the corpsman, and then my other colleagues, Charlie Moore and Al Webb of UPI, came up and helped carry him. And there was also a Marine combat reporter who helped us, whose name I've now forgotten. But we tried to carry him, and then a rocket-propelled grenade came and hit us. I think it killed the soldier we were trying to carry, the Marine. And it hit me in the leg and messed up Al Webb, but didn't hit Charlie. And I was then flown out to a field hospital called Hue Fubai, which was the airport for Hue. And they had a field hospital there, and I had to wait out in the rain because there were so many casualties coming in. And I've never been colder. It was drizzling rain, and my teeth was chattering. I thought I'd break them. And finally they came in and operated on me. But the surgeon was so furious that he'd been told, treat the Americans first and leave the Vietnamese second. And his point was that he should have taken the seriously wounded first and the least wounded second. And he was absolutely in such a rage that I was afraid that he'd hurt me in his anger, but of course he didn't. And, well, that was that.
What about the other incident on the river where there was a moment where you were under fire?
Yeah, I'm not proud of that. We were in a kind of a landing barge type of boat, and we'd seen the boat behind us get hit and sink. And the chief, I think he must have been a Navy chief, anyway, the barge master said, anyone who can pick up a rifle, pick it up and go to the port side and lay down suppression fire, or we won't get out of here. And we had a lot of wounded Marines, and the International Control Commission, you remember those Canadians, whatever their nationalities were, who were supposed to oversee the ceasefire, oversee some kind of peace that never was. So I did what the guy asked, and then he'd say, go to the starboard side. So we'd rush over to the starboard side. And I hope I didn't hit anybody, but, the idea was to keep people's heads down who were shooting at us. And Gene Roberts of the New York Times refused to do that. Said, I'm a journalist, I don't use weapons. And I was having lunch with Gene after the war, and I said, I'm looking back at those days, and you were right. I did the wrong thing. He said, I always thought you were right. So it was a difference of opinion, but I still think he was probably right. I shouldn't have done that.
When was the first time somebody you knew as a correspondent, not as a combatant, was killed in any conflict? Was it in Vietnam?
Oh, yeah. Yes, very much so. I can't tell you the first, but people were getting killed right and left, and especially during the Tet Offensive. And my closest pal was a guy named John Cantwell, an Australian. And after I was wounded, they sent me back to Hong Kong to recuperate. And no, that can't be true. Sorry. Yes, it was true. And he was then killed in the last stages of the Tet Offensive. He'd gone down in a little, remember those mini mokes?
With Frank Palmos?
Yes. And another Australian.
Yes, there were 4 of them, I think, and Frank Palmos was the only one who escaped.
Who were the others? Can you remember who they were?
They were Australian journalists and
Yes.
British journalists, I think.
But there was one Australian guy who was also a friend.
Mm.
And I'll come up with his name.
There was a mini Merkin that was found abandoned later.
Yeah. And when John had been my colleague at time and a good pal, and he was married to a Chinese woman in Hong Kong. And so my job was to go and calm the widow. And my boss, Dick Clerman, who was head of correspondence, called up, and they don't have people like Dick Clerman in journalism anymore. Without asking permission of the company, he said, tell her that she'll get the same widow's benefits as if John had been an American staffer, because he wasn't on staff, he was on a sort of temporary thing. And then he got on the next plane and flew out. And as Chinese traditionally take death very dramatically, so there was it was a very stressful scene. I should tell you about JB when she heard that I was shot. The Time bureau chief in Hong Kong had a sort of a little bit of a stutter. And he called up JB and said, JB, it's about... and he was obviously very worried about how she was going to take it when she scream and yell. And JB said, put him out of his misery, said, you're telling me that David's been hurt but not killed. He said, well, how did you know? And JB said, if you were killed, your instructions would have been to come to the door and not use the telephone, right?
Very sensible. Tell me about the other so-called sideshow conflicts in Indochina, Laos and Cambodia. Did they affect you in some way more or less than the Vietnam conflict? Because they weren't so directly American involved.
True, but I think the one that affected me most was Cambodia, because of what happened, the dreadful Holocaust of Cambodia's end. And but I spent a lot of time in Laos as well. But I never was in a combat situation in Laos. The war was off stage.
There was only one correspondent who ever was, Tammy Arbach.
Yes, who got to Longcheng. Yeah. And even then, he wasn't being fired on, but he got to the secret CIA base. I think Tim Ullman and Fred Bronfman got there once.
And were taken out by the Americans.
Yes.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. But I would sometimes fly up there, but I never got to Longcheng, which was the Shangri-La of everyone.
You'd go to Site 272.
Yes, yes. And they tried to pretend this was Longcheng, but nobody bought that. But Cambodia, was a war situation, especially as the roads were cut off one by one by one, and then finally the river, and then the death of the city, which I wasn't there for. I left about 3 weeks before the fall, maybe a month, and went back to Saigon. That's
when I was there, actually, yeah. Did you ever have any contact with Prince Sihanouk?
Well, the best times with Sihanouk was when, before the war began in Cambodia, when he would allow the press in for National Day. And one time some Americans had wandered up the Mekong, and he put them in prison. And Washington was saying release them, and this was a big, huge diplomatic incident. And what he did, being the stylish fellow he was, he sent the tailor around to the prison and had them all measured for white suits, and then had them up on the reviewing stand and released them. And I remember his speech that he was releasing. I remember he had that high voice, and he said, but their boat will do very well here with our little navy. It has no heart. It has no soul. So he kept the boat. But I remember seeing Shadow over Angkor, the movie that he produced and directed and starred in with his wife. Was her name, what was it, Monica?
Monique.
And about a CIA plot. And so there were never, I can't ever remember a head of state that was as colorful as Norodom Sihanouk.
And looking back on that era, and including all the other conflicts and stories you've done, was Indochina/Vietnam the most important journalistic experience you had?
Yes. Because it was my first big story, first time I'd seen a war.
And you obviously, because of your own social connections, knew a lot of the State Department people and other officials and power people involved. Did you have, at the end of it, a cynicism towards politics in general, or did you just think this is what happens with governments?
More the latter. When I first got there, Henry Cabot Lodge was ambassador, and he was very kind to me, invited me around.
You must have met him before.
Yeah. And so, but I just thought they were wrong. I don't know if you'd call it cynicism. I just said they're on the wrong track. They don't understand this.
What about someone like McNamara, who took a long time to come around to the idea that the war wasn't as he thought it was, but at the same time he was the guy that did commission the Pentagon Papers. So he had a sort of dual relationship to the truth in a funny sort of way.
Yes.
What did you make of him, and what encounters did you have with him?
Well, I got to know him a little bit after the war when he was coming around, and I think he'd just written his book where he said, I got the whole thing wrong. And I never bought that line. Plenty of people were there to tell him, but he didn't want to know that. I think there was a willful ignorance that I think American leaders had. And, at this time he was completely apologetic, and he was saying, I was wrong, I got the whole thing wrong. And I think that time when he went to Vietnam and he talked to the North Vietnamese leaders and they compared notes, how did this look from your point of view when we were doing this, that was very useful to his conversion. And he became, Mrs. Graham befriended him, and maybe they had always been friends. But so I met him when Mrs. Graham came to a music festival in Vermont, and I was there with Tom Winship, my boss at the Globe, and we talked a lot about the war and journalism, and we went up to see John Kenneth Galbraith. And McNamara hopped out of the car and said, Ken, you were right and I was wrong. And Ken Galbraith was gracious about that. But the point was made, It was McNamara's surrender. Intellectual surrender. Yeah.
How did the impact of what you learned in Vietnam affect your own notion of how foreign policy was affected, and how did you think about it later when you saw other intervention?
Well, with Iraq, I couldn't believe that such a short time later we were going down the same road. And then I saw a photograph of Vice President Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in President Ford's office as Saigon was falling. And I said, my God, it's not that they're making the same mistake. They're saying this time we're going to get it right and do it right. And of course, they didn't do it right.
And did you think that when you covered, I think, the Saddam Iran-Iraq conflict in the 80s?
Yes, I did, yes.
And then were you involved in the 91
Yes.
war as well?
Yes.
Did you find it not deja vu, but somehow that with your experience, somehow it was you were able to think more clearly about what was going on? And did this mean that when you spoke to officers, you didn't necessarily think they know more than I do, sort of thing?
Well, you know, I was getting to be so much older than they. And when I met General Dempsey in Baghdad, he'd obviously Googled me, or someone briefed me what my background was. He said, "Oh, you were in Vietnam," and I realized that he'd been too young to have been in Vietnam. So, you know, I think that age began to make me look at it a little differently, and but I saw the same willful self-deception. Everything's going well. We're going to win this, and everything's going to work out, and it didn't. The can-do American that is so attractive in most circumstances, you know, can get things done, worked against us in these interventions, military interventions. Because the American officials would always say everything's going fine, and reporters are either just not getting the right story or they're unpatriotic. And I saw this again and again in Baghdad and in Kabul. And Sebastian Junger, he wrote The Perfect Storm and a wonderful book called War about Afghanistan. And he put it wasn't that the Americans were actually lying, but they were inviting you to join a conspiracy of wishful thinking. And I found this deliberate self-deception of how things were going continued. You remember we used to call the military briefings in Saigon the 5 o'clock follies because they bore so little reality to what we knew was going on in the field. And so I think that was another lesson of Vietnam we never learned, haven't learned since. And the other, I think, was 40 years ago, right now, here we are in mid-April, we were seeing an American-trained army, an American-equipped army, simply collapse after millions and millions of dollars we put into everything, and they took off the uniforms and ran away. And I saw this again everyone saw last summer, the Iraqi army just melt away before ISIS. And I think the two are linked in that both our Iraqi regime and the South Vietnamese were affected by corruption, and in Iraq by feuding between Sunni and Shia, which we didn't have in Vietnam, but the corruption hurt both regimes, and I think that again, our enemies always seem to have the edge on patriotism. The South Vietnamese could never get over the feeling that they were fighting for a foreign power. And the communists were able to grasp the nationalism issue. But again, that's the anti-colonial struggle. And the same within Iraq. There was a famous reporter named Tony Shadid. He worked for the Boston Globe and then the Times, the Washington Post, and then the New York Times. Died in Iraq, in Syria. But he once heard some Iraqi soldiers talking. They didn't know he spoke Arabic. He was Lebanese and could speak fluent Arabic. And they were saying, oh, well, we know we're fighting for foreigners, but we need the money. So, and I think, the jury's still out in Afghanistan. But I think the same factor that the Taliban knew of Afghanistan, of all places, the anti-foreigner struggle was woven into their DNA. And I remember I was there, 5 years ago now, and the Taliban was putting it about, would you rather be Dost Muhammad or Shah Sulja? And as you know, Bruce, that was Dost Muhammad was the king, and the British thought he wasn't what they wanted, so they put Shah Sulja on the throne, and then the disastrous defeat of the British army, and Dost Muhammad was back. And the Taliban understood that anti-colonial nerve that they could press, especially upon the Pashtun people. So I think that I had an interview with Martin Dempsey, who's now the head of the Joint Chiefs in Washington. But 10 years ago, 5 years ago, he was, 10 years ago now, sorry. 10 years ago, he was in charge of training the Iraqi army. And I had interviews with him and his staff. And what they were saying was it's comparatively easy to train a man to fight. Harder to teach him about logistics, to get him fed and keep ammunition and all this kind of logistics of a modern army. But the hardest and almost impossible is to motivate them. And that's going to be up to the Iraqis. So we were never able to motivate the South Vietnamese sufficiently. We were certainly never able to motivate the Iraqi army. And I fear that we're not able to motivate the Afghan army either, but we'll see.
And looking at your career, because you had a lot of fabulous experiences, and including the beginnings of the end for the Soviet bloc in '89. Do you think that you were part of the last generation which has the opportunity to do these vast trips and experiences, or not?
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I think you're right. I don't know that. Well, I'm sure it happens. There are some reporters who are doing this, but it certainly I was able to have a front row seat at the end of the last half of the 20th century, and be in a lot of places where news was really being made. I had an interview with an official of the Polish Communist Party, and to my astonishment, when I went in to see him, he shoved this piece of paper across the table and said, "Get this translated. What this is announcing the dissolution of the Polish Communist Party." And all these books of Marx and Lenin were around the walls. And he said, "Look at that. All my life I've believed in socialism, and now I see this has all been for naught, that the system never worked, and you've won. And but, there are faults in your society too, and you have to be careful about that. And maybe one day communism and capitalism will meet in the middle, and you'll come down and we'll reform. But communism is dying before my eyes, my belief of a lifetime." And I thought, what a scoop I have.
When was this?
89. So I went back to my hotel room, and JB was there in the hotel, and I was typing this up frantically with the Boston Globe in those days. Ding! We all still had typewriters, and or at least I still had a typewriter. And JB said, "You better come in the next room." I think the television was in the bedroom or something. And I said, "No, JB, I'm on deadline. I got the story." She said, "No, I think you better come in." And there was the Berlin Wall coming down. So I went on to Berlin, but that story was dead as a doornail.
That's the most extraordinary thing about journalism, is the happenstance. I mean,
Yeah.
Prince Suparnavong of Laos
Mm-hmm.
made his return to Vientiane on the very day that I think Pompidou died.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the same thing with Aldous Huxley dying on the same day as JFK.
Mm-hmm.
It somewhat puts things in the shadow,
Yes.
in the shades.
Yes.
What happens.
Yeah.
What about your, if you had to philosophize and be a sage,
Mm-hmm.
what would you think about the notion that somehow humanity will be able to, or should be able to, resolve its problems and have peace and harmony and work towards common goals, etc.? I mean, that's what one imagines should be happening, but perhaps there's another point of view that conflict is almost eternal in the way that humans forever have things that they dispute to the highest level, no matter what the other conditions are like. I mean, how do you foresee the future of the world in that sense?
I think the goal of mankind is to manage that instinct of conflict. But I don't think it's ever going to end. I think it's in our genes. I spent some time in New Guinea, both the Indonesian part and the Papua New Guinea. And of course there, those societies lived in little language groups. I think there were 700 languages or something, and constantly warring against each other. And there weren't huge casualties, but there was a war every few weeks against some other tribe, and they lived in these conditions of conflict. It made me think that the primitive state of mankind is conflict. And, I think it's in our human genes. And the best we can do is manage it.
And I should also, of course, as an addenda to this conversation, ask you about the Middle East, because that, of course, is the critical conflict for the world at the moment.
Yes.
Your assessment of the situation would be that, I'd like to hear it actually, what you think is the necessary actions of the Palestinians and the Israelis to go forward, or are you pessimistic about such things? Or
well, you have to be a little pessimistic, especially under the present circumstances. But I think it's absolutely vital for Israel is now the last colonial power. I think Ari Shavit said in Haaretz, we're the last people to boss it over another people.
Conquered people, yes.
Yeah, conquered people. And so I think that sooner they can get rid of that, but it's not moving that way at all. And of course, it's like the United States and Iran. Over the years, the moment the Palestinians have been ready, the Israelis haven't been. And the moment the Israelis have been, the Palestinians haven't been. So it's been a missing thing. But I think if they don't get rid of, if they don't set the Palestinians free, it'll be very bad for Israel in the long run.
And the world, perhaps.
And the world, yeah.
And you'd spent time as a bureau chief in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Did
The Washington Post opened a bureau there much later than the New York Times had. So I was introduced around, you know how the Israelis like to lay heavy history on you. And this amusing head of the press office saw the party line I was being introduced to, and he'd introduced me. Here's David, the first Washington Post bureau chief in Jerusalem since 2,000 years.
I see. And your opinions, did they evolve much in that period?
Well, I didn't come in, it wasn't like Vietnam. I didn't come in with a strong opinion. And I admire the Israelis, and I like them. And I look back at that period as a very good time. But I also was sympathetic to the Palestinians and thought they were getting a raw deal. So, I saw both sides of it and thought the only solution is for Israel to get rid of this problem and set them free.
What's the position with American correspondents in Israel? There tend to be more Jewish ones than there are from the other Western countries. What do you think of the idea of Jewish and perhaps Arabic journalists from America covering a conflict like that? Do you think that matters or not?
I don't think it matters, but I know that the American papers felt that for a long time. And I think that both the Washington Post and the New York Times were reluctant to send a Jewish reporter as bureau chief in Jerusalem. I think they were wrong. And in fact, I had an Israeli press officer, an army officer who was taking press people around. And he said, give me a corn-fed Oklahoman, Kansas, American boy who's Protestant, Catholic, something like that. But don't give me the Jewish reporters saying, you can't buy me. I'm not going to be bought by you. And I can always impress a guy from Kansas, some kid from Protestant or something. So I think the idea that Jewish reporters were going to, pull punches is absolutely wrong. And I think that's been proven.
Yeah. And the final question, I guess, is what do you think of the liberal interventionism as practiced by Bush and Blair? Do you think that the consequences are worse than allowing people like Gaddafi or Saddam or Assad to survive under certain circumstances?
I think the results are perfectly clear. Are we better off with Libya as it is than it was under Gaddafi? And I've never understood why it was in America's interest to get rid of Assad. And I think I'd look out for liberal interventionism. You obviously, in my experience, you're going to cause more troubles than you solve. And they have to make up their own, the countries involved have to handle those kind of problems. You can't. Now, there can be exceptions. I think George Herbert Walker Bush did the right thing pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. But he did it the right way. He got an army there, pushed them out, didn't go too far.
With Arab approval as well.
And a huge Arab coalition. And then ended it. And I think that was exactly the right way to go. I think the worst problems we can get into is when we decide we're going to make these people over in our image. And the neoconservative idea that we were going to transform Iraq into this liberal democracy that would recognize Israel and all the other countries in the Middle East would become like tiny Americans. I had an interview with the Russian ambassador in Kabul 5 years ago. And he'd been there as a young guy during the Russian occupation, and now he was back under the American occupation. And he said, you're making the same mistake we did. We really thought we were coming here to do good. We were going to save this country from Islamic extremism, and that the Afghan in his natural state would want to be a communist. Why not? Some did. And you think that every Afghan in his natural state would want to be an American. And some would. But you think that purple dye on the finger showing that someone has voted is going to solve 1,000 years of ethnic and tribal rivalries. I think he was absolutely right. So if you're going to have an intervention, do it quickly, get in, get out, and don't try to make them over in your image.
And don't own the story.
And don't own the story. Don't own the war.